Hello everyone and welcome back. My name is Nathan and this is Sioux Shrimp Breeders. In this video I want to talk a little bit about CO2. CO2 is one of those things that I get asked about every so often, and if I use them in my shrimp tanks. And I always answer the same way, and that is no. Now there was a time in my shrimp keeping where I did use CO2 in my shrimp tanks, and that was when I very first started. I did a DIY CO2 setup, and after I had it set up for a while, I would notice a couple of things. One of the things that I noticed about the DIY CO2 for shrimp tanks was that the pH was very inconsistent. And when I was using that, I was using the yeast and the sugar in the 2-liter bottles, and it was working fairly well. But then what I noticed about the pH is that my pH was fluctuating all over the place because I couldn't seem to get the same exact recipe, and sometimes the yeast is different when you buy it from different stores. So what would happen is that my pH would drop down to about a 6.4, which my plants love and my shrimp would be okay with. But then what would happen over time is that that bottle would wear out and the pH would start to rise again. And so when my pH was starting to fluctuate all over the place, I noticed that my breeding was not that great in my shrimp tanks. Now, CO2 is one of those things that I love watching plants grow like crazy. And if you have a CO2 system in your shrimp tank or in your fish tank, you will notice a dramatic increase in plant growth, but there's a lot of risk involved. Now, if you're new to CO2 and you've never messed with it before, it's kind of a little tricky thing. There is a guide that you can use, and it's called the KH-pH chart. And what it is it tries to let you know the balance between the two and if you are pumping too much CO2 into your tank. If you do put too much CO2 into a tank, you can actually kill everything in that tank. And there was actually a time where I did notice that my DIY CO2 did sort of malfunction, and it just kind of released everything at once. And it only lasted a couple days, and I noticed that my pH was down to about a 6. So now with the DIY CO2, when you're using it for fish, it's not such a big deal because I think fish are just a little more tolerable towards pH swings like that. But when it comes to some pretty sensitive shrimp, I would not suggest to use the DIY CO2. I do have a 10-pound CO2 system that I will reset up again in the future, but right now all I have is shrimp tanks, and I really don't have any planted tanks that I want to put it in. So I'm just going to leave my CO2 tank until I move into my new house, and I'm going to set up hopefully a really big fish and planted tank. So what can happen sometimes with these DIY CO2 systems is that you can't really shut them off. So at night, when they are putting out a lot of CO2 and your plants aren't eating up any of that CO2, it can cause an oxygen deprivation in your tank. And what it can happen is that your shrimp will float to the top and try to get out of the tank just because there's absolutely no oxygen in the tank for them to breathe. And just to show you a little bit why I don't use CO2, there is a plant that I have that's a little more delicate, and usually people would use it with CO2. Now I've been trying to grow it in my shrimp tanks without CO2, and I find that it's growing pretty good. It is growing a little bit slower, but it is taking root. What I did notice about having CO2 in my shrimp tanks was they were not breeding as well as they were without, and I also noticed that they were kind of getting a little bit stressed during the day where normally they wouldn't. One thing you'll notice about a lot of my shrimp tanks is that my tanks are pretty messy. I don't try to aquascape whatsoever, and it's just because I like to think more about the shrimp than I do the plants. The plants will grow no matter what, and if they die, the shrimp are going to eat them. So I just kind of let my plants grow wherever they want and however they want, because I don't want to keep shoving my hands in my tanks and messing around with plants, because that's just not good for shrimp either. There can be a lot of things on your hands that I don't want to put in my tank, so I don't really ever put my hands in my tank unless I absolutely have to. You'll notice in my crystal red shrimp tank how it's just absolutely packed full of plants, and this is after I've taken a lot out already. And what I noticed to happen in this tank was if it gets too full of plants and my rotala gets out of control, what can happen is there also can be pH swings without CO2, because during the day all the plants are intaking all the CO2 they can, but at night they're not, so they're not producing any oxygen. So what can happen is if you have too many plants in your tank, you can actually cause pH swings during the day and night. So I really want to keep a good balance between the plants and the pH and the shrimp. Another reason why I didn't like to use CO2 was the price standpoint. It was a little bit pricey to get my CO2 filled. My 10-pound tank cost me around $45 to $50, and it would last around 6 months. But in the end, what I noticed was that I almost had too many plants, and I didn't really have anywhere to put them. And now that I have just an entire shrimp room full of plants, I really don't need any more, and I find that they grow just fine without it. So that is going to be it for this video. I really hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, be sure to hit that subscribe button and that like button. And I hope you have a wonderful day, and cheers.